My name is Christian Bason, and I've been looking forward to giving this video presentation to you today. I want to talk about redesigning public services and what's the shape of the next model of public service from a perspective of design or design-led innovation, you might say, and also from a global perspective. However, building on some of the work that we are doing here at MindLab in Copenhagen. So MindLab is a innovation unit. You might also call it a design lab or design studio. And we're part of the Danish government. We're part of three major ministries: the Ministry of Employment, the Ministry of Business, and the Ministry of Education. And actually, we're also joining forces this fall with a large city in Denmark, the city of Odense. So we are an internal unit in the public sector. Our staff have backgrounds or are employed in the public sector, but they have backgrounds, professional backgrounds that are quite different than you usually would find. So backgrounds in anthropology, in sociology, in media science, and certainly in design. Next slide, please. And what I would like to talk about today is basically an agenda that covers three things. And if you hit the next slide.
Just hold on, Christian.
Have an agenda there?
No, I can't get to reach the slides. No, so now it's slide 2. Is that correct?
Okay, slide.
Your office.
It's the office. This is actually the slide I would like to use for the speech I just gave about who we are. So I forgot to say next slide. But can you use my speech, or should we do it again?
Yeah, just go on.
Yeah. So go to the next slide.
Agenda.
Yes. So what I'd like to talk about today is basically three things. Why is it that we need to redesign public services? What is going on with design globally? And finally, where is public sector design headed, and what can you do to promote a positive development, also in Sweden? Next slide, please. So why do we need a redesign? As I mentioned at MindLab, why do we have the skills and the backgrounds that we have? Well, we have them because we're very concerned with putting citizens at the center of public services. We're very concerned with supporting a process of innovation, a process of getting new ideas amongst public servants and public employees to find solutions that are actually better both for people but also for society. And let me give you a few perspectives on what this challenge or this redesign is about. Next slide, please. Well, first of all, and this is another photograph from MindLab, we have a lack of innovation ability in the public sector. We lack often creativity. We lack the ability to challenge our own thinking. We lack the effort, the systematic effort to work continuously on finding better solutions. The risk is that even though innovation does happen in the public sector, that it's too random, it happens by chance, it's run by individuals, not by organizations. And so one redesign challenge is to simply embed innovation efforts in the public sector much more systematically. And believe it or not, the photograph you're seeing is basically from this is from a government office in Copenhagen. But as you can see, quite a different process, a creative process we're running there. Next slide, please. The next question is very much at the heart of what we do. It's also very much at the heart of design, and it's about what I often call professional empathy, the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, in their context, and understand how they experience the world, whether it's a hospital patient, it's an unemployed citizen, or it's a struggling startup business. And one of the redesign challenges we have is to basically get more empathy within the public sector, both in the way we develop new solutions, but also in the ongoing governance of the public sector. Next slide, please. And thirdly, there's a lack of value creation. In these times of austerity and of economic challenges, are we good enough at getting higher productivity and getting more for our money in the public sector? Are we good enough at delivering the service experience again with empathy, that people expect from us and should expect from their government. Are we good enough at enhancing our democracy through participation, enhancing legitimacy and citizens' rights, accountability, and so on, all the good things in a democracy? And finally, and probably most importantly, are we good enough at getting at the outcomes we want from the public sector in terms of health, employment, quality of life, growth, and so on? So these are three redesign challenges that we have. Next slide, please. And we are finding and discovering at MindLab that design has something to offer with these challenges. And even though I have a background in political science, I'm learning how design can really, really help us move ahead on some of these agendas in a way that's very different. It feels very different, and it also delivers different results than the usual tools we've applied over the last decade or two in government. Next slide, please. So what is design, you might ask? And as I have a couple of examples here from both Herbert Simon, the Nobel Prize winner, who says basically design is about finding courses of action or drawing up plans that are aimed at changing the current situation into one that is better. It's an extremely broad definition of design, but nonetheless one that fits quite well with what the challenges we are facing. Another way of defining design is from John Heskett, who says that it's about a human capacity to change our environments in ways that satisfy our needs, but also gives meaning to our lives. And if you look at a lot of public services today, that's basically the challenge: is how do we find ways of shaping public services that both satisfy needs, but also are meaningful when we meet them. Next slide, please. So the last decade, at least, has seen a growth in some of these buzzwords you're seeing right here on the screen: service design, human-centered design, citizen-centered design, interaction design. Some of them are actually words or terms that we've used since the early 70s. But it's not until the last decade, perhaps, that we're seeing them win prominence in some circles in the public sector, especially those of us working with public sector reform and innovation. And there's a lot of experimentation happening right now, also globally, not just here in Denmark or in Europe, but around what does this actually mean for the future of the public sector. Next slide, please. So here are a few characteristics about what design in a more tangible way perhaps is about. It's about, when you are looking at problems or challenges, to really be aware of reimagining what the problem is even about. And I'll get back to some of the tools, but it's certainly about, again, understanding people's situation or organizations' situation in the context they're on. Design is about a human approach, understanding what drives behavior and what is meaningful, as John Heskett said. It's about an experimental approach, very much about testing and prototyping and trying things out rapidly and quickly and learning in a quite different way than we as typically as experts in government tend to develop things in a much more linear and much more structured and analytical way. And finally, it's about being concrete. It's about using visual tools in a number of ways to drive the creative process and to solve problems. Next slide. So some of these design approaches are typically found, and they are also the ones we use at MindLab: ethnographic research, engaging end users to document their own situation, running lots and lots of workshops collaboratively with our colleagues across government, with experts, with citizens themselves, engaging people in co-designing solutions, and again, as I mentioned, testing experimentation. Next slide. So given the redesign challenges we have, you might say that design is also about exploring mystery. I mean, the mystery of how do we get to a different algorithm? How do we move from the current situation where we are failing in many ways in public services, not delivering smart enough services, not helping people with their health, not helping them with the job seeking, and how do we find out what is the new algorithm, what is the new formula, if you will, for public services? I think there's a search going on right now for a radically different way of organizing and running the public sector. And in that sense, using Roger Martin's model here, he calls it the knowledge funnel. You could say that it's actually balancing between these two perspectives, exploring the mystery of what might we do differently, but also, of course, the day-to-day operations of running a formula for how we do things in government. And that formula is being contested right now. Next slide, please. So what I'm finding, and also in some of the doctoral research we're doing here at MindLab, is that design can certainly do three things for us if you're a public manager and you are looking to this as a tool. It can help you make problems visible in a different way. It can help drive the creative process with highly visual tools. And design can also enable change in the world, meaning that design is also the physical artifacts and the graphics and so on you find in your everyday work environment. It can actually influence what you do as an employee or how you experience things as a citizen. It's about digital design as well, of course, in terms of shaping and making websites in ways that are useful for citizens. Next slide. So a case example would be where we have applied design recently working with the Danish National Hospital is how might you design or redesign a more meaningful patient experience. How do you do that? Well, you start with the ethnographic research, observation studies of how patients interact with the rooms they're in, the technology they're using, and certainly with the staff. And then you, through this observation, find insights about what is the meaning of lots of different things, such as the conversations with doctors, understanding what's going to happen to me, the role of time and waiting time, the role of noise and the physical environment, and so on. And some of the work that we've done in the healthcare sector showed that there's a radical potential in rethinking healthcare around the patient and even optimizing the patient's time and patient's flow rather than the system time and system flow. And that's a disruptive question to ask, of course. How would things look like if the patient's time was more important than the time of the doctor or the nurse? But that can open up new avenues. And one of the outcomes of the project we did here is actually quite tangible. It's a way of giving a different experience of waiting. So the hospital is now almost finished in redesigning an entire piece of the floor for the waiting room and the waiting experience for patients. Next slide. What I'll show you in a minute is an example of what's going on globally around design labs. Just like MindLab, there are a number of organizations now globally that are working with some of these tools, and these are some of the characteristics you can see of these types of organizations that are either inside or on the borderline of government, and that work systematically with redesign, just like we do at MindLab. So this is just a definition of what do we mean by design labs or design studios. Next slide. On this slide, you see a global map of what's going on. These are just some examples, and this is a map developed by an organization in Canada called Mars, which has just established its own design studio in Toronto. But you can see globally a movement from both not just in Europe, but certainly also in Asia, Australia, in the US. And I know for a fact that there are things happening in Latin America as well, and Africa, emerging on social innovation, certainly, and increasingly also on design. Let's take a look at some of the examples of what's going on. Next slide, please. So this is just a clip from a video developed in Finland where the Aalto University worked on redesigning a hospital, or thinking about a new shape of a hospital, and build a live, full-scale prototype of the new physical setting and the new services. So Aalto University, but also Helsinki Design Lab has worked quite a lot with also the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra on applying design in public services. Next slide. In France, the 27th region is a design-led innovation unit that works with the French regions. Next slide. Nesta, whom I think you'll also hear from, has a public services lab, an innovation lab that works with redesign from outside government, but very intimately working with government. Next slide. There's a European Design Innovation Initiative that I have been part of and has published a report now following up with an action plan for how design can drive innovation both in the private and the public sector. And I could add that right now I'm actually chairing a committee in the European Union proposing recommendations on public sector innovation across the member states of Europe, where design will also certainly feature as one of the methods, approaches to driving more innovation in government. So it's very high on the European Union's agenda, both for the President Barroso, but also for the Research Commissioner, Mayor Geoghegan-Quinn. Next slide, please. The United States has established an innovation lab inside the Office of Personnel Management at central level, and is actually, again, taking a human-centered design approach to what they're doing in Washington. Next slide. And finally, in Australia, there's the Centre for Excellence in Public Sector Design. I think it's called Design Gov now, and is a federal exercise in embedding design into the federal government in Canberra. Next slide, please. I'd like to conclude with some thoughts of what kind of new model of public services are we seeing emerging, and how is design helping discover that new model, or discover the new algorithm, if you will. So let's take a look at what's going on when you unleash design and what happens to an organization in the public sector. Next slide, please. You can call it discovering co-production, and I've written a couple of academic papers on this. It seems that if you unleash design approaches, this is the green circle, you begin to challenge the current business model or the current model of governance on delivering services to citizens. And you explore difference in how can you change the relationship between system and people, and you explore different ways of doing that. For example, the relationship between patients and doctors and nurses. And you also shift focus very much on what actually happens and how are outcomes shaped. So how are better health outcomes being shaped by the interactions that are going on? So these are two things that happens that are unleashed or triggered by design. And what we're finding is that this leads to increased public value. For example, faster treatment of patients, a more rapid return to health, more meaningful interactions with people with a work injury, and quicker return to labor market. We're finding it in basically across a number of systems. Adult mentally handicapped who are getting better services and more thriving, with a lot higher productivity and services for them. So across different cases, there's simply a new business model or a new model of government, which you might call co-production. And in this conclusion, let me share with you what co-production is really about. So that is about co-producing service outcomes or public sector outcomes with citizens rather than trying to deliver them to them. Next slide, please. So instead of acting as an authority that does things to people through services, regulations, how might we shift to a different mindset about organizing public services? Next slide, please. Where you produce outcomes with family and friends, of course with public servants as well, but with other actors in society that can all be part of the solution, and where it's about producing outcomes both for citizens individually but also for society, and leveraging all these resources that are around in the context people live to help them succeed. Next slide, please. So, to conclude, what are the tough questions that you might want to ask, and what are the tough questions we're looking at MindLab, both from a research perspective and also from a very practical, hands-on, everyday work perspective in our project work? First of all, how do you make designerly approaches legitimate and authorize them and make it okay to work in a different way? I think we've come quite far here in Denmark with our work, but still you have to build legitimacy about this is okay to work in a very different way that can seem foreign to many in the public sector. And one way forward that I might recommend to you in Sweden is to begin establishing design labs, not just projects or teams, but design labs that are embedded in your organization. Just like in the United States, for example, the Mayo Clinic, the hospital, has a specialized design lab. Kaiser Permanente has an innovation lab. You need to build these things in organizationally, structurally, not just as a nice little project. Secondly, how do you govern co-production? What's the new organizational model behind this different paradigm of running public services? How do you balance empathy, citizen engagement with authority and professional experts as well? How do you strike the right balance so you don't throw away some of the good things about the public sector we have today? And I think without giving a real answer, you need to begin to rethink how you organize. You have to begin to rethink, if you take citizens and outcomes seriously, what might be the next organizational model for a city or for a hospital or for a state? Our work with the city of Odense in Denmark is actually already looking at that. One of the things they're looking very much at is what would the new organization of a city government look like if everything you did was about the citizens? If everything you did from the back office to the front line was about the citizens? You might ask yourself that question too. Thanks for your attention. Next slide. Just a teaser. It's all about leadership. It's all about leadership getting there. It's also all about allowing for the uncertainty in the process, but getting to the result. And then next slide, please. Allow for yourself to have those reflections. And next slide. Here's my Twitter account and our email or our website. You're most welcome to take a close look at what we do. Thanks for your attention.